So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the breath and mind. And what is the relationship between breathing and the mind? We know that when people are stressed out, we'll tell them to take 3 deep breaths. But does that actually do anything? Does it work? So the first question that we've got to figure out is, what is the relationship between breath and mind? Does our mind influence the way that we breathe, or does breathing influence our mental function? Does your breath change when you're feeling a certain way? So we can think for a moment about excitement, right? Or fear. Or even something like arousal, And in anxiety, we know that people hyperventilate. So we can see that our mood does affect our breath. But does it work the other way around? We can tell people to take 3 deep breaths to calm down. But if you start hyperventilating, will you feel anxious? And it turns out that the answer is yes. In studies on anxiety, they'll have people breathe from a gas mask that actually has 7.5% CO2. And this concentration of CO2 mimics hyperventilation. And that concentration actually induces physiologic and neuroscience changes consistent with anxiety. So the most controlled way we know to induce anxiety in another human being is actually by having them breathe a particular concentration of air. So now we can understand that there is a connection between the breath and mind and breathing, that it's actually a two-way street. And this is actually the way that most things in our body function. Our body and mind have systems of homeostasis and reciprocal feedback. What this means is that there's always a loop between 2 systems. For example, our brain sends chemical signals that make us crave food. And then in turn, when we eat something, our stomach actually stretches. And when our stomach physically stretches from the ingestion of food, it sends signals back to your brain to help you feel full. So there's almost always a two-way connection anywhere in your body. And so now our next question becomes, now that we know that, okay, breathing affects mind and mind affects breathing, what is the way in which these 2 things interact? If we look at breath, what are the qualities of a particular kind of breath versus another? What are the different dimensions of breath? So now I want you guys to think about different kinds of breathing, right? Think about anxious breathing or calm breathing. Or angry breathing, or aroused breathing, right? How are each of these breaths actually different? And if we look at those different kinds of breathing, what we discover is that breath has 2 major components, rate and depth. So let's take a quick look at that and see what we can learn from different kinds of breathing. Okay? So, what we see is that breath has 2 different dimensions, rate and breath. So if we look at something like angry breathing, we can see that angry breathing is fast and deep. And if we compare that to something like anxious breathing is also fast, but it's also quite shallow, right? So it's rapid and shallow. And then we can think about something like calm breathing, which is slow and deep. And then we can even think about something like normal breathing. So normal breathing is a little bit faster and not too deep, but also not too shallow. So we can kind of see that there are different dimensions of breathing. So let's kind of just look at that a little bit more closely. So this is where we can kind of make a 2x2 table, and we can say there's fast breathing and slow breathing. And then we have shallow breathing and deep breathing. And what we can do is actually fill this chart in with the different kinds of breath that we have, right? So we know that angry breathing is fast and deep. And we know that calm breathing is deep and slow. We know that anxious breathing is fast and shallow. And then we also know that sort of general breathing, our normal breath, is kind of calm, shallow. It's not too deep because we don't usually breathe too deeply, and it's relatively slow. So we can kind of divide our breath into each of these different parameters. So the next question is, if we're feeling anxious, Can we actually alter our breathing to change our mood? After all, we usually tell people to take 3 deep breaths, and does it actually work? And there's actually a really fascinating study on this, not precisely on breathing, but when I was doing neuroscience research at Harvard, I went to a conference, and I met a really fascinating researcher there who was kind of talking a little bit about the research of facial expressions. And so this researcher in his lab, he was trying to figure out what percentage of a facial expression does someone need to make before an observer can tell what they're feeling. So if I make an angry face, and then I start smiling, if you actually look, my face actually transitioned from angry to smiling, right? So there's a lot of tiny little shifts in facial muscles that cause me to transition from anger to happiness. And so what he did is had all of his research assistants practice each facial expression, or each research assistant actually specialized in one particular facial expression. So one research assistant learned how to make an angry expression, and then he taught them how to make half of an angry expression, or a quarter of an angry expression. And in his research study, what he tried to do is show people like pictures of half an angry face, quarter angry face, 3/4 of an angry face, or a full angry face, to determine when did someone figure out that, oh, this person is angry. But the really interesting thing that this researcher told me about is something really unexpected happened in the lab, which is that there started to become a lot of conflict amongst his research assistants. And it turned out that the research assistant who was practicing making angry faces all the time started to actually feel really angry and irritable and kind of started snapping at people. And the research assistant who was learning how to make fearful faces all the time actually started to feel more fear. And the research assistant who was kind of learning how to make happy faces all the time actually was kind of more buoyant and happy. And so what this researcher actually discovered was that everything in our body is a two-way street. And as we kind of come back to this idea of breath and mind, we come to our final and most important question, which is, can we actively control our mind through our breathing? And the answer is a resounding yes. If you look at this ancient yogic system of pranayama, or in China what's called qigong, these systems basically demonstrate that the way to control your mind is through your breathing. Yogis in ancient India, when someone would come to them and would say, I want to attain enlightenment, I want to attain kind of everlasting peace and happiness, I want to be happier in life, can you teach me how to control my mind? And the yogis would say, absolutely. And the first practice that they'd actually teach them was a breathing practice. Because the yogis said, learn to breathe this way. And if you breathe in this pattern, you will feel this kind of thing. If you breathe in this pattern, you'll feel this kind of thing. So a lot of the techniques that we're actually going to teach you in this module, we call them meditation techniques, but technically they're not meditation techniques. What they are is pranayama techniques. And pranayama are particular breathing techniques that are used to cultivate a particular attitude of mind. And the good news is that some of these techniques directly counter anxiety. In excitement, people, I'm going to start from the top. Let me just look at this. Wait, this looks weird. So the first thing to understand, do I need to redo that? Damn it. Okay.
If you want to, you can.
The next question is how, I'm going to just do that from the top, okay? Can I start the whole thing over, actually?
Sure.
Okay.